Our best teachers are the women who have lived through domestic violence. It's their voices we need to hear and learn from.
There should be no judgment, only compassionate action.
Feeling safe and supported means everything in making wise decisions.
Nothing seems right and everything seems risky. To tell your story.
This is happening in Stratford. These are the people in your neighborhood. They're right next door. They're in the same house as you. They're in the same family as you.
We must believe women.
She knows the situation best.
Welcome to Supporting Survivors, Responding to Domestic Violence in Perth County. This video shares experiences from survivors of intimate partner violence, women who reached out to service providers in Perth County. We share insights from these stories with the intent to improve the way we respond to violence in our community. Presented in 6 chapters, we will explore red flags and risk factors, trauma, justice, the legal system, compassionate action, and society's role in responding to domestic violence. This video offers true insights and reflections. It offers professional guidance to help show where, when, and how our agencies can empathize with victims of domestic violence and to better understand and support their complex needs most effectively. We must believe women. There should be no judgment, only compassionate action.
Trauma happens and harms us, but I often wonder if the worst trauma is the second wave, when your story is misbelieved, mistrusted, and maligned. May your story find a safe harbor in the presence of people who will honor both your vulnerability and resilience.
This is my reoccurring nightmare of walking down the river road and all of a sudden just falling into a pit of despair and crawling and grasping at the walls, but I'm never able to get a grip.
Violence in relationships occurs when one person feels entitled to power and control over their partner and chooses to use abuse to gain and maintain that control. Every relationship differs, but what is most common within all abusive relationships is the varying tactics used by abusers to gain and maintain power and control over the victim.
It takes so much for a survivor to come forward in the first place just to say that what they're experiencing is happening, and just to say that to another person, right? Because any emotional, mental, spiritual abuse that is happening is saying, don't go forward, don't tell anybody this is happening. And if you do, they won't believe you because it's all your fault that it's happening, right? And so it takes so much for her to build up the confidence, to build up that urgency that she needs to tell somebody what's happening.
It started when I needed help moving one day. And so one of my friends offered to help, and they brought a friend with them. And he kind of just kept hanging around my house and helped out with stuff.
When I met him, I thought he was just the most wonderful person. I later found out that he was, in fact, putting on a show.
It was a high school relationship. It certainly could not be called a romance, one that never should have happened.
When I became pregnant with my 3rd child, with my husband, he started to get really abusive. I had lived in abuse my whole life anyway because of my dad, so I just kind of thought it was normal.
While the numbers are high, these reports and calls don't fully represent the total number of victims of all forms of domestic violence in Perth County and across Canada. In Canada, 70% of people who experience spousal violence have not spoken out to any support services.
Throughout the relationship, I didn't know who to turn to. What he was doing to me was emotional, psychological, verbal, and of course it's really hard to catch those things. There's no proof of that. And I found, especially as I've dealt with 4 different judges, I've spoken to police officers, I feel that people don't believe me.
I think believing survivors is number 1, is paramount, because the more that a survivor comes out and she's not questioned or doubted, or people try to make suggestions as to why it could have happened because she was involved, as opposed to just saying, yes, this happens and it needs to stop, I think that will be a big change.
there are so many people who can't believe what I'm telling them because my spouse doesn't appear that way to them.
They hear a story and they're like, oh, that person, they wouldn't do that, right? And we hear that often, where there's just not an understanding of, the prevalence of violence in homes and in our communities. And I think that it seems so unbelievable, and people are sort of shocked. They, it's hard for them to believe, and that becomes their response.
You can't just leave. You don't realize how bad it is until you're out of it, and no one can tell you otherwise. And you're told for years for a million reasons why you can't, sometimes in the most subtle ways. You don't recognize it or see it as control and abuse.
People don't realize, first of all, how prevalent the problem is, and then even when they come face to face with issues around domestic violence, there's understanding, how difficult it is to leave a relationship, all the things that trap victims.
And then I thought, if I can line up distractions for him, whether it's a television show or opening up a bottle of wine or something, I never wanted to have any unplanned time. I was very strategic. Because that window of uncertainty, when my son wasn't around, it was just very strategic. I didn't know what he would say or do.
A lot of women can stay in relationships even when they know they're not safe and healthy for their children because of economic priority, but also if they leave with their children, then their abusive partner might have access to parenting their children without that woman's monitoring. And that could be very frightening.
As of 2021, there's no one working in the domestic violence field who wouldn't do some sort of structured interview where you'd include the warning signs about, prior abuse, separation, stalking. Is he depressed? Has he threatened to kill himself? Has he threatened to kill you? Does he have access to firearms? You'd want to go through the risk factors, and then you have to share with a victim survivor, that not only living with abuse, but it's also, very dangerous.
He was extremely controlling. He told me that my breasts, because I was nursing my son, were his and no one was to see them. Very possessive. And my body, he didn't like it when I dressed up. He didn't like it when I looked nice. I wasn't able to talk to his friends because then I would hear, I wanted to be with them. I wanted to be intimate with them. I prefer them over him.
He started driving to my work while I was there in the daytime, and he would hang around. He would call people at my work. He would call my boss, and he would trash talk me. One day, I was at work, but I was out. He called, and he thought I was lying to him about where I was. So he told me he was going to burn my work down. I heard him go downstairs, and I heard this really loud bang. And I go downstairs, and he took my dog's leash, and he was hanging himself from the rafters of my basement. Why would he do that in my house? It was still such a whirlwind of me worrying about him. I wasn't seeing any reason to protect myself. I was just trying to help him. I just thought I was trying to help him.
And shortly after I became pregnant with our son, he started showing his true colors. Started off trying to spend time together before this miracle was coming into our family, and very quickly he put me into my place, that I was a completely ridiculous person. And that's when the verbal abuse really started.
So we know, right, violence escalates. We know that violence escalates in a relationship where abuse exists when there's a pregnancy, when she's, essentially paying more attention to her needs and the needs of her child. So we know that those things can mean that violence will escalate, but that's not why the violence is occurring.
You really need specific training in this form of domestic violence because it doesn't leave bruises.
And now I think one of the terms in both research and practice is the element of coercive control, that you're really looking at one person's attempt to control and dominate their partner in a variety of ways.
All these sorts of things go through your mind, and all the while, these people, like my ex, are twisting things to make you think that you have lost all sense of reality. And all the while, they're just manipulating you, and they're keeping you so they can control you.
You know, I have clients who are allowed out of the house to go grocery shopping, but they have to come home with a receipt from the grocery store to indicate exactly, you know, what time they checked out, you know, and their partner, you know, has timed how long it takes to drive home.
A hollow pit had developed in my stomach as I worried how I might explain what he had found on my phone. That must be it, I thought. He had requested the password to my phone a few short weeks before. His reasoning was that of the kids needing to see pictures or some other worthless excuse. I knew why he wanted it. Yet it was the same reason I didn't want to give it to him. I had been planning my escape for months, and there would be traces of those steps if he had looked hard enough.
It's really important for somebody hearing that story to be aware that when she chooses to leave, that is actually one of the most dangerous times. Any time that the abuser is at risk of losing control is a time when there is a heightened safety risk. So for example, if she chooses to leave the home, if she chooses to block his number, those are times where we have to be extra careful of her safety.
I've been strangled, physically kicked out of the bed for not complying, keys thrown on the roof, wedding rings thrown away, locked out of the house, told to get out of the car in a rainstorm to walk the rest of the way home, the wall punched beside my face. I wish you were a man so I could punch you instead of the wall. I could go on and on. I felt completely powerless.
Trauma is something that happens when our body and our brain systems become overwhelmed. So all of our natural coping systems that are in place to help us deal with threat or to help us deal with danger become overwhelmed by the severity of what's happening in front of us. And that can be impacted in a couple different ways in terms of what makes it more severe. And that can include who is around when it happens, the level of support we have. It can be impacted by our expectation of the event. Do we feel like we are at risk of mortal or physical danger? And is somebody that we really care about at risk of danger as well?
He started holding me hostage. He basically came in the door and he had a knife to his own neck and he said, "If you make a sound, or if you scream, or if you say anything, I'm gonna slit my throat." And so I just sat there quietly. And then it kind of all blends together, like I was just in shock while everything was happening.
Trauma affects our basic instinct for flight, fight, or freeze. It is a release of cortisol in our brain, and cortisol allows us to react quickly, to get away, to evaluate a situation, or to keep ourselves safe by freezing.
He just started screaming at me. I was the reason for the failures in his life. I was the reason why he was taking this job that he hated. I was the reason why he didn't have any money. I was the reason for every problem, and he was not very kind about it, swearing and screaming. He drove off to work, and I was in the bathroom, in the shower, just sitting on the floor, bawling my eyes out. I remember thinking, I just feel so stuck. I was 8 months pregnant at the time.
But when somebody has gone through trauma, oftentimes their memory of the incident can be spotty and can be different a couple different times that they come back to that memory, because that's the way that our brain encodes that moment. We are encoding for the biggest danger signs. We are not encoding for, a beautiful chronological story that we can report later. Our brain is thinking, what's the biggest thing that's going to keep me safe next time?
It was a necessary but scary shift to try and process your life in an entirely different way. While having been through a long period of trauma, to having the stress of being in a courtroom and reliving all of the past, it feels like ripping everything open again, re-victimizing ourselves to tell our story to strangers. And of course, sitting in the courtroom, glaring you down, is the person who has damaged your heart, your head, and your intuition the most.
Supporting a woman through a trial, we don't do it all that often, but when we do, and I'm speaking for myself, it's very impactful. So, hearing her testify, hearing her story, it wasn't just impactful for me, but I'll never forget the judge in that case saying in his summary, when he was in the sentencing process, saying, "Your story is so unbelievable that I didn't believe you at first," right? But he was saying that in terms of, just the totality of the abuse that she experienced was unbelievable to him. And so he wasn't saying, "I don't believe you," but the things that you were saying, it was hard for me to hear and was hard for me to process. And that's, a trial judge who's heard a lot of things. So the things that she shared with him and what she experienced from the time she was a child right through to being an adult in her home, it was unbelievable. So I think that just speaks for me to the piece around trauma.
And I remember thinking, I don't even know if I can say the words. I remember saying, I'm really upset about some things and my home life isn't very good. But I couldn't even bring myself to admit that in a confidential setting.
So how do we communicate that this is a safe space? Even the word safety can be a trigger word for some people. So providing security, comfort, predictability, full permission for the person in distress at whatever stage they're in to have choices.
Folks who are wanting to help or are helping or maybe in contact in any social service setting or any helping setting need to be trauma informed, because that's how they will receive the information differently from someone who's sitting across the table and telling their story.
And I said, if you guys don't charge him, I have the evidence. And that's the only reason they did charge him. They called him and said, hey, can you come on down here? Sorry, we have to charge you. No handcuffs, nothing. And he drove down Erie Street with me hanging out the vehicle, screaming for my life.
Psychological abuse has a lasting mark. There are very deep, lasting scars from psychological and ongoing emotional abuse. And nobody's talking about it. Nobody recognizes it. Nobody sees it as an issue, and I'm sick of it. I feel that there's nowhere to go.
When we talk about trauma, we often don't talk about all of the other physiological symptoms that are happening at the same time, because like I said, trauma is overwhelming our whole body system. So it's really immensely fatiguing to hold up this wall for a long time. So if a person is very tired and also having trouble sleeping, that is a symptom of trauma. If a person is having a hard time focusing, concentrating, being in the moment, that's oftentimes because their body is hyper aware to everything else that's going on. And so paying attention to one thing can be very difficult and can be very trying. We might notice little things like jumpiness. That is a sign, again, that their whole body is busy taking in the entire surroundings and not paying attention to what's happening in this moment, because they need to monitor for their safety every second and every aspect.
I think the police should be aware of a domestic violence mindset and how one can be afraid to hold the violent individual accountable, or perhaps not understand the situation and best actions.
When we hear a woman say, I don't want to do this, that might not be, I don't want to report, or I don't want to tell you what happened to me. That might be, I'm having a hard time, or I'm struggling, or I can't do this right now. So those are the things that we hear maybe a little bit differently than somebody else might say, oh, she doesn't want to tell anybody what happened to her. Where we're like, she does. She's just, she's having a tough time.
Police spoke to my abuser about me and what the problem was, but never asked me.
There are obviously survivors who call the police. They're the minority of survivors of domestic violence. People who call the police are more likely to have suffered repeat violence over many weeks, months, or years. They're more likely to feel that things are shifting, they're getting worse. They're more likely to worry for their personal safety, worry for their lives, and that they reach out to the police at a point in crisis.
When I came in to report my incident, I was forced to describe the situation in the lobby while the officer took notes. There were other individuals coming and going, and it felt inappropriate to discuss such sensitive matters like that in public. There were no recommendations of obtaining support or advice on the best course of action. I was given the option of pressing charges. I was and still am afraid of this individual. Of course, I said no to pressing charges at the time. I was terrified. I still have nightmares.
This is the most intimate details of your life, and you want to share that with somebody. And if the person responding to you is aghast or, try, shh, we don't want to talk about that too loudly, you're gonna shut down immediately. Well, that's what it's like for somebody to come forward.
Yeah.
And like Jasmine said, it may be 2, 3, 4, 5 times that they reach out for help before they're ready to leave. Or if they leave, they go back, and then they, for so many reasons, and then finally there'll come a time when, okay, I'm done for good. But it's all about how that information is received that can make the difference between life and death sometimes.
Either professionals or the general public who aren't informed about these issues just think that it's simple, like, are you abused, yes or no? The answer is yes. Here's a phone number for the shelter, or call 911. And it's much more complicated. It takes a lot more time for someone to share the truth about what they're experiencing.
The police came. I was shaking furiously. They took our statements and then instructed us that no one would be forced to leave their home. And I could leave, but could not take the children. I told the officer that I was the primary caregiver and was still the one who got up with the children at night and was still nursing our youngest. "Didn't you say she was almost 2?" replied the female officer with an insensitive, judgmental tone.
It can be really difficult to sit with a person when they are experiencing trauma. It can be really difficult to sit with a person who is not acting like the best version of themselves because they have dealt with a very difficult thing. And so the biggest thing that I can recommend that I certainly have to practice myself is taking care of my own stuff. If I take care of my own stuff before I come in, then I am not projecting my own past experiences and my own stuff on anybody else. And if I've had a really tough day, if I've had to deal with a lot of people who are experiencing really big emotions and it's really impacted me, to have a safe space that I can debrief that with somebody.
I now had the record, and my probation officer wouldn't listen to me. I said, no, I didn't assault him. He's gaslighting me. He's abusive. And she said, nope, looks like you're the one that did it because they have a file saying I do meth.
Domestic violence does not have a socioeconomic root. It does not have an ethnic root. It's broad. It's everywhere. It's more often than not exactly where you don't think you're going to find it. And so each time you hear a story, each time you're called to a story, each time a woman speaks to you, realize that anything that you might have as a preconceived notion is out the window. That there's no standard for abuse.
Police should have to understand these situations look differently on everyone.
My abuser would gaslight, call authorities. Police would show up and refuse to listen to me. No matter if I was okay or not, they insisted on taking me to the hospital. If I refused or panicked because I didn't want to go, they would handcuff me. The whole interaction, they treated me as a problem to deal with, not a victim. They would listen to my abuser, but not me.
So secondary wounding is when somebody brings us their trauma, they say, this happened to me. And if we respond in a way that invalidates them, if we say, well, what did you do to cause that? Or if we say, well, what were you wearing? Or if we say, well, it was just one time, or it wasn't that bad, or are you sure it happened like that? Or, are you doing okay today, with your mental health? If we check in any way that makes that person feel like it was their fault, if we check in a way that makes that person feel like they are overreacting or being sensitive, or that they are maybe not mentally well, then that can actually cause the trauma to be compounded, because that will shift the way the person views what happened to them. And so they're more likely to take on blame, to take on guilt, to take on shame, emotions that we already take on naturally with trauma, and it can actually make our traumatic response worse.
I don't know if it's when you're sitting there and you're being abused, but you're conditioned, right, to believe that it's your fault, or that there's something deceptive about you, like, what do you do, right?
Often in the first appointment, I ask a lot of questions, just to get an overview of what you're coming here for, you know, what your goals are and what you want support for. Is that okay? I ask permission. Is that okay? Does that sound like it's workable for you today? Again, if I see a visible nervousness, anxiety, normalizing it. It's weird, isn't it? Talking to someone you've never met before, and here I am, you know, you don't know me, I don't know that. So we normalize the discomfort. Of course it's uncomfortable. I want to do my best to give you the space and time that you need. Always checking in so that they have a choice.
I was urged to pursue a restraining order, and after speaking to the officer, was shocked and hung up crying. He brushed it off, saying they couldn't pursue the paperwork at that time because of COVID, and maybe try again later, as if domestic violence just waits for a convenient time. He then said, well, if something happens, just call. Clearly, the point is to avoid that something happening in the first place.
So it is a really, really big thing when that person reaches out. And so I think it's really important for any of us who get reached out to, whether you're friends or service providers or neighbors, that we first give that person so much choice.
For the record, I had paid 2 visits to the station during the time and called once regarding the restraining order. Current day, nothing was done on their end. I have moved twice in the last year, and he has attempted to reach out to me online and made it clear he will try again. So I'm left always looking over my shoulder and knowing that lockdown won't last forever. We will eventually come face to face.
As helpers, what we do is, as we've said a couple of times now, is listen and ask the questions about, okay, so given this mandate that we have, how can we help you? And sometimes it's about ignoring the mandate and doing what we need to do for her. Nobody is an expert in anybody else's life.
I'd rather people be able to get help when they need it than help after something has happened. The law needs to change because the law says they can't help unless a crime's being committed. Work with the police to help these women understand what's happening if there is obvious confusion and fear. Feeling safe and supported means everything in making wise decisions.
I do know in general when we did a study 40 years ago, hard to believe, we did a study asking women what they wanted. These are women in London who had called the police related to domestic violence. And we said, what could the police have done for you? What would have made a difference? And at the top of the list is, I wanted help from my husband. So the woman's partner, you know, I still love him. I want him to change. I'm frightened, but I want him to get help. They're worried about their children and their children's safety and their children's adjustment to these circumstances. And third on their list was, I don't want to be blamed for the violence. When the police come to my house, I don't want them to ask me, what did I do? I want them to listen to, you know, what I went through and, you know, the history of the, you know, of the situation. So those were the top 3 wishes, and they haven't changed 40 years later. It's not rocket science.
You know, it's not about the best interest of the children. For a lot of lawyers, it's about making money.
One of the challenges is making the courts accessible and affordable. We know from research that about 75 to 80% of litigants now are representing themselves. Most people really can't afford to go to court. Even lawyers can't afford to go to court. There was a recent headline story talking about the cost of litigation. So it means that we really have to redesign the court system to make it more accessible.
I have a recording of him calling me names, verbally assaulting me in front of my son. I had it documented that my symptoms were ongoing because of domestic abuse. The judge dismissed the family violence, and she said everybody claims that they're abused and this is nothing special. So she pushed us to the Superior Court, and all the judges that we've had since have all dismissed the abuse.
With emotional and mental abuse, the truth becomes very murky, it becomes very cloudy, because there are all of these little kind of insidious statements and manipulations along the way. And so if we can encourage women to write down instances and times where things happened, they can have that not only as a record for themselves, but if they want to pursue any kind of legal action at any point, they might have that available to them.
And sure enough, I find out that essentially the court system is not pro-mother. And the people along the way, they give you these false ideas that we have a leg to stand on, and all the while it's a patriarchal society. It favors men. It's like an old boys club. And even when you comment on domestic violence, which I have done to all the judges, they dismiss me. And the one judge almost laughed at me.
The first judge, because of the change in the Divorce Act, recognized coercive control and that is something that I've experienced. He actually chuckled under his breath. He said, "Everybody says that," and dismissed it. The judge said something to the effect of, "If I listened to that in every case, I wouldn't get anything done."
I thought, when you get in front of a judge and lawyers, and you get in front of the courts, I thought that people would shine a light, and the good people win, and the bad people don't. That's not the case. And I really wish that women knew that going forward, because I was naive. And I thought better of this system, and I thought better of this country.
I also regretted it when I had to go to court. It's not an easy process for anyone, especially for those that have low self-esteem and need to sit in front of a room of strangers and the person that hurt them most and explain what happened and the history behind it. It's certainly a journey I wish I never went on, but I realize it was a necessary event in my life.
And I think that most justice responses, safety is for everyone, first and foremost, including themselves, understandably so. But understanding that a woman, if her abuser is sitting across the table from her, is not going to give you the information that you're looking for, right? So in kind of a broad spectrum, to create a space that's as safe as absolutely possible for her to tell her story, and then not question maybe the sequence of events, because she's not getting it all out properly yet anyway until she's calmed down a little, but just to gather as much information as possible without judgment, without preconceived notions, and then sort it out at a later time. But that piece around safety, making sure that she, at least in that moment, feels safe, is huge, I can't think of anything more important.
The first contact by the female officer made the world of difference to me. It was less intimidating. I realize you get whomever is on call, and I was very lucky that night. And later on, to have her by my side, to ask questions and be more prepared than I would have been, not familiar with the court system, it meant the world to have her there when I had to share my story.
One of the challenges for victims is they can be beaten down by the court system. The court becomes an extension of the abuser. So the abuser hopes to wear the victim down emotionally and financially by dragging things out through the court system, by making things difficult, by denying the reality of the situation, by putting in claims that are totally, unrealistic for the circumstances. And there's no, there's no easy answer. I mean, judges may be wise, but they don't have a crystal ball and trying to, look into the future. Judges are only as good as the information they get. So judges need, around them, they need good advocates, good lawyers. They need people who, for example, the Office of the Children's Lawyer, they might need someone to do, good assessment and represent the children's interests. They might need someone to do a child custody or parenting evaluation, which involves interviewing, both parents and the children, and then collateral sources such as teachers and doctors and others who may be involved with the family. So judges require a lot of good information to come to the best decisions.
There should be no judgment, only compassionate action. Months later, when everything came to a head and all those years of being sexually violated, used and abused, and all those years of thinking I was this and that, pretty much every disgusting thing you could hurl at a woman was hurled at me, and I believed all of it. Still do.
You feel helpless. You feel ashamed. You feel embarrassed. Because you can kind of spin it however you want to look at it. Are you letting them do that? Well, you think that you should have known better, maybe?
I worked my whole life and I just wanted it to look really, really good. So I played into it when he was a jerk. I would cover for him because I didn't want it to look like that. I didn't want to be in that life anymore. I told that to myself most of all.
We hide our true lives for so long that finally revealing it and outing ourselves feels so wrong, and I found it so embarrassing that I lived that life, that I allowed myself to be treated so terribly, that my kids saw this relationship and would think it was normal. I didn't want that for any of us.
Of course, in my role, it's assessment. It's thorough assessment, because a lot of people will come into this kind of setting sharing struggles in a relationship, but it takes time for trust to build to be able to, for someone to feel comfortable. Because there's a lot of judgment and stigma still with women who are in abusive, controlling, violent relationships. And so a big part of meeting someone is, of course, creating a grounded and very focused, supportive environment, but one of non-judgment and accepting wherever they are. There's a lot of internalized shame in survivors or people living with abuse.
My therapist gave me the courage to say, no, it's actually not okay. You should get out. You need to get out of this immediately, and you need to find a safe place to go. And I remember her saying, you should call the police when you ask him to leave.
It can be one of the highest risks, times of risk for a woman who leaves, that their own life will be in danger. Because if the perpetrator feels that they can't have her control, then we see, of course, the worst case scenarios, the potential of those worst case scenarios happen.
So I moved into the Emily Murphy Center, and that is when things finally changed. They were incredible. I didn't talk to anyone for about the first 5 months. I didn't even leave my apartment. I just stayed in there. I didn't even pay them rent. Like I just, hid.
And I still got the feeling that I didn't find that the police would actually recognize it. Because again, that piece where he wasn't physically beating me up, and it's his word against her word, like his word against my word. And I didn't have any confidence in the services out there.
I think that a lot of times there is an immediate response, well, let's call the police. Right. That's not necessarily the only answer, the only solution to this kind of a problem. It's certainly one of them, and it's a very important answer, but it's certainly not all. There are so many resources in Stratford and Perth County that really opens up a diverse sort of response to any woman who is coming forward.
There was no clarity with the people that I was talking to request help. Every time I called, they'd say, okay, who is this? I'd have to say everything over again. By the time you get through, you're sick of talking. I've done this already. I just wish there was a better, easier filing system.
When I brought my concerns about my abuser to his employer, the first question was, how do we know you're not just seeking revenge? He did something bad to you, now you're doing something bad to him. And I certainly had no idea that there was any kind of organization out there that might be able to help support me going through this and help me to recognize that this wasn't appropriate.
I think the breakthrough we still need is to make sure that the public awareness goes from 30 to 40% to 100%. We need to make sure that there's not a professional in any sector, that there's no police officer, teacher, family doctor, marriage counselor, mental health professional, social service professional who doesn't understand the dangers of domestic violence and the impact on victims and children, and also knows what resources are available in the community. There's no excuse for ignorance.
The woman at CAS asked me to send her the video for her to review and then sent me a letter closing the case a few weeks later, stating that I left as a result of physical violence. It was a relief to finally have validation of what happened, but still frustrating that after multiple attempts to follow up with the police through the domestic violence representative, no one from the police had asked to see the video or acknowledged what happened that night.
People who are committed to meet around a table and address where the gaps are. What happened in this specific situation where the victim was diminished, was this, was that. When we can collaboratively as community resources come together, and that's the model that I think exists and needs to be well-funded and resourced and supported.
With other services, there was no clarity with the people that I was talking to request help. I wanted to call and to be able to say, "It's me," and they'd see the file and they could look at my story quickly.
The bottom line is it's going to take the whole village to keep a family safe, and that whole village has to be working together.
My love for him did make it harder to leave. I had to understand what was going on and to be honest with my therapist. The women's shelter worker was incredible in helping me understand the mechanics of what happened.
The Waterloo Region program, which I think is a model for the province, really came out of their own commitment. So the police service made it a priority. They have the most officers assigned as domestic violence specialists, so they have over 20 officers and a domestic violence coordinator. So per capita, they have more police focused on this issue, and they have the one-stop shopping program in terms of their Family Justice Center.
Reporting to us, it goes without saying that if you're picking up the call and you're calling Optimism Place, that the person on the other side of that phone is going to believe what you have to say. There's no doubt. And sometimes it's embellished, sure. Sometimes it's remembered incorrectly because we know how trauma informs the brain. So that's a big thing. But ultimately, something bad has happened to this person who's calling us, and we're going to help. That's not everybody's response. It's not everybody's training. If we could change the world, things would be different for sure. Yeah. It's about everyone becoming trauma informed. It's about knowing as a community that trauma affects people differently and how they relay their stories, if ever, is different, and how to respond to those needs.
I think there should be a shift in society. And I think that the systems that are out there are supposed to support us, that are supposed to help us. I think that they need understanding and training, particularly with the unseen or the silent killers. Psychological abuse, manipulation, nobody is crediting that as something worthwhile to talk about.
I haven't slept with the window open the whole time. And so the other night, you have to learn to breathe again. I slept with the window cracked open, not locked. And that was the first time I was able to do that. And I was only able to do that because he is gone.
I think society plays a big role in the fact that we have to change our mindset. And people actually have to stand up and recognize that any level of abuse, whether it's physical or psychological, emotional or sexual, it's all wrong. You can't treat people that way, which is part of the reason I wanted to share my story.
If you ever need anything else, just feel free. I'm happy to share and talk and anything beyond that. Put me on that list. And I'm happy to be a voice.
And I think that's the problem with society, is that we have been convinced that men can do this. And they get away with things like this, and men don't stick up for women, other men that see things happening. And I think females feel very vulnerable.
There's the societal piece, right, that sexual assault within a marriage is only a recent charge, right, within our history. And so just believing women that they have rights, that they are not to be treated that way is a new idea in our society, believe it or not. And so it is that societal conditioning, it is that kind of family perspective of you're supposed to be this person for your partner.
The reality is that the majority of survivors don't call the police. They don't go to formal agencies. The first line of defense tends to be friends, family, potentially neighbors, co-workers. So usually the first disclosure may come to sort of the immediate support system.
Even with my girlfriends, we're so close, but I didn't even feel that I could talk to them.
Even his own mother told me that he had anger management issues just after my son was born. And I remember thinking, this might have been something you should have shared with me. Some of the stuff eventually came out in front of my dad and my brothers, and they loved me unconditionally. And they were making excuses for him too.
One of our human defenses is denial. Right? We don't want to see things that are uncomfortable. We don't want to feel things that are uncomfortable. We don't want to share things that are uncomfortable. So as individuals, to be able to be willing to see, to be willing to engage, to be willing to check in, is uncomfortable. We don't always get it right. We don't always have the words as friends and family, but to check in and go, how are you doing? It must be rough over COVID, over this, over that change.
And it does make people uncomfortable talking about this issue. I think it's not something that everybody is as comfortable as we are to talk about what that looks like for folks. And I think too, people don't recognize how often it happens. And I think people maybe understand domestic violence and they think about who might perpetrate violence and they might have a certain idea in their minds about who would do that.
But it's this small town. I didn't want anybody to know in town because everybody knows everybody. You go to a restaurant and see people and then they know somebody and they all went to high school together and then I just didn't think that people would validate what I was experiencing.
It's sometimes important just to start with, I care about you, I'm concerned, I don't know what this is about, I'd like to be here for you, you're not alone. And rather than grilling someone about all the things that they're living with, just reflect that love, concern, and support without judgment. Whatever's going on, I'm here for you.
Yeah, so he was in the house and started beating me up that night, and so it was loud, like he was smashing. He was throwing a whole vase at me, like for flowers, and smashed it right off my head. He was trashing everything, dressers upside down. It was just insane. And so one of the neighbors called the police.
The province of Ontario has funded a campaign called Neighbours, Friends and Family, that provides lots of resources about how to speak to a victim, how to speak to an abuser. There are programs for Anglophones or same education material for Francophones in Ontario. For Indigenous people, they have a separate campaign that's culturally appropriate, and they have a campaign for immigrant refugee population that's in 16 different languages. So we have the resources, the material. Part of it is how to do a much better job in terms of using social media, going to where people go, live, and visit. Obviously, we have to, modernize our approaches to reach more people. And I do think we need to do research to measure the impact of campaigns to make sure we're shifting attitudes. We need to collectively decide on, what are the key messages? What do we want people to know? We want them to know it's a problem. It's a serious problem, and it's everywhere. It's not, not hidden in some corners. And we need people to know there's something they can do.
But in his family, everybody always made excuses for him. He was always tired or had a bad day or poor him, Oh well, poor him. He missed out on something.
I think it is really important the way that we receive anything that a survivor says, that we take it, that we believe it, that we validate it, that we don't question why, that we don't question why they chose which feeling they're experiencing, why they did certain action, that we should take it and say, yes, that's what happened. And I think through that, again, we can prove that we're a trustworthy person to them and to be in that circle, right? We need to earn that trust. And so to continue to listen and continue not to doubt can help the survivor to be able to bring out that voice and to say what really happened or to bring their truth.
So the police took me there, and they actually drove me around Stratford to housing and wherever that day to get everything set so that there was no room for error. Like, he was going to kill me. And I asked the officer one day, I said, because he was the first cop, the very first time we had an encounter with the police, he was the cop that took me back to the house to get my belongings. He wasn't the arresting cop, and he wasn't there for that. But I said to him, like, what was your impression that day? He goes, oh, I knew. He knew. He said, I knew it was him. I still know it's him.
And I ended up telling my doctor about it because we have to start telling other professionals what we're going through so that they can identify it when they see it present in other patients or clients of theirs.
But I think my take home is, I think that this is not a realistic society. I think we need to talk about this. I think this should be addressed in schools. I want light to be shed on this.
Domestic abuse and coercive control are behaviors that belong to the controlling person. The victim is not responsible for this behavior, and no amount of love or stability from the victim will change that. We need to stop seeing it as merely an argument between two people and start seeing it as a dangerous situation in which one person has become a threat to another. We need to start taking it seriously and raise the status of domestic abuse. We need to make that leap.